Can the CalRecycle team and HF&H turn on their cameras? Perfect. Thank you guys all. So it's 1 o'clock now, so let's just get this ball rolling. We have a lot to cover and we want to get to the live Q&A as soon as possible. So welcome everyone to the Central Coast Regional webinar. My name is Ashley Yee and I'm CalRecycle's SB 1383 Implementation Manager. And before I turn it over to Julia Doloff, who will go over the logistics of the webinar, I want to introduce you all to who's going to be presenting and or available to respond to questions. So when I call your name, just wave hi so people know who you are. So from CalRecycle, we have Kyle Pogue and Martine Boswell representing edible food. From procurement, we have Scott Beckner, Michelle Dewey, and Kristen Pidcock. We also have Kara Morgan representing collections. Julia Doloff is also representing collections and helped put together all of these great regional webinars. So thank you again, Julia. And we have Alan Elizario and Trisha Moore representing the compliance and enforcement group here at CalRecycle. We also have Sarah Khalid, who will be helping with the Q&A portion along with Julia. As you can see, we have some CalRecycle people who are not, who are new, as you can see, we have people from HF&H who have helped us develop all of the 4 model tools. So as a refresher, we have the model franchise, the model ordinance, the model procurement policy, and the model food recovery agreement. So I'd like to introduce them as well. So we have Rob Hilton and Tracy Swanborn. Many of you guys know them. Rob is HF&H's president, who leads HF&H's 1383 efforts, and Tracy is the senior manager with HF&H who actually manage the development of the 4 tools. So now I'll turn it over to Julia to go over all of the logistics.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm just going to get the screen pulled back up. Okay, there we go. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. So today, each team will be providing an overview presentation of the regulatory requirements for each specified topic. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session in which CalRecycle staff, so Sarah and myself, will unmute participants to allow you to ask your questions over the webinar. Please use the instructions shown on this slide for the Q&A portion. If you're watching via the CalEPA broadcast, you may email your questions to the SLCP inbox. If you're using the GoToWebinar platform, please type in your question into the question pane. Staff will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked to by CalRecycle staff, and please state your affiliation before asking your question. CalRecycle staff may respond to some questions in writing through the GoToWebinar platform, so please review the question pane for those responses. For those watching via the broadcast, we will also be verbalizing some of the questions that are responded to in writing so that you may hear them as well. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. Therefore, today we will be focusing on questions or clarifications regarding implementation and tools. If we are not able to get to your question today, we will follow up with you at a later date. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle Pogue and Martine Boswell to cover the Edible Food Recovery Program requirements. And I just realized that I didn't change the slide, but we will have these instructions up again before the Q&A portion actually starts. So my apologies for that. So Kyle and Martine, it's all on you.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Pogue. I have been part of this rulemaking for quite some time, and Martine and I have led the edible food recovery rulemaking process. And I want to start by thanking all of you for attending today. My guess, and someone else has a number, I think we've had about 1,000 attendees thus far. on our webinars, and it looks like we're going to add another 100 plus today. So spreading the word to all of you, and we're happy to share that. I do want to say that this rulemaking and what you're going to hear today that Martine's going to cover in detail is really a testament to feedback from a lot of different stakeholders, including probably many of you in the room today, but stakeholders from local government, from food recovery organizations and services, industry associations and edible food generators and public health departments, the waste and recycling industry, and other state agencies, and there's some that I'm leaving off. So it has been a collective effort to get here, and we think that these edible food regs are really going to make a difference in California. And thank you for engaging in them and helping us roll into implementation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Martine Boswell, who's going to talk to you about these regs more, and then we're available for Q&A afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. In the first presentation, we're going to be giving a high-level overview of SB 1383's edible food recovery goal and the policies and regulations that have been developed to help California achieve this ambitious target. So for anyone who isn't familiar, as part of California's larger plan to combat climate change, SB 1383 included an edible food recovery goal. So what does that mean? Well, it's written in the law of SB 1383 that no less than 20% of currently disposed edible food needed to be recovered for human consumption by 2025. Now, I want to clarify a couple of things about this goal. This is not a goal for individual jurisdictions to achieve a 20% edible food recovery rate. This is also not a goal for individual food facilities to arrange to have 20% of their surplus edible food be recovered for human consumption. Rather, this is a statewide goal that California must collectively achieve. It was also specified in the law of SB 1383 that CalRecycle needed to adopt regulations that would be intended to help achieve the 20% edible food recovery goal. Now, one last thing that I think is important to mention when we talk about the edible food recovery goal. Above that goal in the dark gray and the black, you will see the organic waste disposal reduction targets. When the organic waste disposal reduction targets were written into the law of SB 1383, they specified a baseline year for which progress would be measured against, progress towards achieving those organic waste disposal reduction targets. So I'll bring your attention to the 75% goal, that the state must achieve a 75% reduction in the statewide disposal of organic waste from a 2014 baseline year by 2025. What's important there is that 2014 baseline year. The edible food recovery goal, when it was written into the law of SB 1383, a baseline year was not specified. So it's really important to keep in mind that 2014 will not be the baseline year for which we measure progress towards achieving the edible food recovery goal against. CalRecycle will most likely be using data from our 2018 statewide disposal facility-based waste characterization study, which measured it separated food into 8 different material types and measured the amount of potentially donatable food that is disposed in California. So most likely 2018 will be the baseline year for edible food recovery. Next slide, please. So some of the high-level policy components that I'm going to discuss in this presentation are outlined on this slide. The first policy component that I'm going to discuss involves, well, actually, it's actually not on this slide, but it's edible food, how edible food is defined. The second policy component involves commercial edible food generators. These are the entities that will have direct requirements placed on them, where they will be required to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed be recovered for human consumption. And again, on this slide, I'm just giving a high-level overview of what's required, but I will go into more detail in the subsequent slides. The second policy component that I'll cover involves capacity planning. specifically looking at as all of these entities are now required to donate their edible food, we'll have a lot more food available for food recovery. But in order to make sure that that food is recovered, we need to ensure that sufficient capacity exists. So that's really what those capacity planning requirements are intended to do. Third policy component involves jurisdictions and their requirement to implement local edible food recovery programs. And the final policy component that I'll cover today involves food recovery organizations and services. For the food recovery organizations and services that establish a contract or written agreement with commercial edible food generators pursuant to SB 1383, they will be required to maintain records and report certain information to the jurisdiction. Next slide. So what does edible food mean? I like to start by defining edible food in the context of SB 1383 because you hear this term so often. And depending on who you're speaking with or what organization's report you're reading, edible food might be defined differently than how it's defined in the regulations. So in SB 1383's regulations, edible food is defined as food intended for human consumption. That's very broad. However, the regulatory definition also specifies that nothing in the regulations requires or authorizes the recovery of edible food that does not meet the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. So this is absolutely critical. Just because the food is intended for human consumption, that does not necessarily mean that it can be safely recovered for people to eat. So it needs to be intended for human consumption and also meet all of those food safety requirements specified in the California Retail Food Code. Now, we also specified in the definition in the regulations that edible food is not solid waste if it is recovered and not discarded. This is very important to remember that this is a material that is before the bin. It's food, and if it can be safely recovered, it meets all those food safety requirements, and it absolutely should be going to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need. So just to provide you with a little information about the photos on this slide, the photo on the right, for example's sake, is food that's been out on an unsupervised open buffet line where the customer is able to serve themselves. Most county health departments in California would not allow for this food to be donated, mostly because the customers are serving themselves. So you don't know what's happened to the food when it's been out on that open buffet line. So even though it's intended for human consumption, it doesn't meet all of those retail food code food safety requirements, so this could not be donated. But again, CalRecycle does not enforce food safety. You would need to check with your local environmental health department to verify that that this food can be donated. Compare that, however, to the photo on the left. This is food, actually, this is a real photo that was taken from one of CalRecycle's food waste prevention and rescue grantees. This is an example of their recoveries that they were making from K through 12 schools. And for example's sake, we'll just say that none of those eggs are cracked. All of the food meets the food safety requirements. So this is food that could be safely recovered. Next slide. So going into that first major policy component that I want to discuss, the regulations place direct requirements on commercial edible food generators. The entities that you see on this slide are the commercial edible food generators. So the tier 1 generators will be required to begin arranging to have the maximum amount of their edible food be recovered for human consumption beginning January 1st, 2022. 2 years later, on January 1st, 2024, the tier 2 generators will be required to begin complying. Now, we separated the generators into 2 tiers for a few different reasons. The tier 1 generators typically already have food donation programs in place. So this is not a new practice for them. Because they've been doing it, it won't be as heavy a lift. They also tend, not always, but tend to have larger amounts of surplus edible food available for food recovery than the tier 2 generators. And the types of food that they have available for food donation, usually it's a lot of produce, fresh or frozen grocery items, things like that. we have the infrastructure and capacity or food recovery networks in place to be able to accept that type of food. Compare that, however, to the tier 2 generators. A lot of them don't have a food recovery program in place. This is a newer practice for them. They typically have smaller amounts of food available for food donation. And on top of that, they oftentimes have prepared foods, whether it's cold prepared foods or hot prepared foods. There are some areas in California where we do not have the infrastructure in place or the food recovery networks in place or the capacity to be able to handle that type of food. So we wanted to give jurisdictions, commercial edible food generators, and food recovery organizations and services an additional 2 years to prepare for compliance. Next slide. So the key requirement for the commercial edible food generators is that they are required to recover the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed through a contract or written agreement with one or both of the following. The contract or written agreement needs to specify either that the food recovery organization or service will come and collect the food directly from the generator site, or the contract or written agreement can specify that the food recovery organization will accept food that the generator self-hauls to the food recovery organization. Next slide. To assist commercial edible food generators with complying with these requirements, CalRecycle, along with HF&H consultants and diversion strategies, developed a model food recovery agreement. It does not have to be used, but it absolutely can be used, and it's highly customizable. Some of the bigger goals of this agreement is really, first and foremost, to assist commercial edible food generators with compliance, to ensure that edible food is recovered in a safe and effective manner, but also to protect food recovery organizations and services from donation dumping. Something else that's very exciting about this model food recovery agreement is that it also identifies potential food recovery arrangements that could ultimately have the cost of recovering the food be shared. So during the rulemaking process, something that we heard very often from our food recovery stakeholders was that it's expensive to recover food. And oftentimes they're the ones having to cover all of these costs associated with the recoveries. So as much as those costs can be shared, it would really be helpful for them. And ultimately, we hope that these regulations do help foster the development of sustainable funding for food recovery organizations and services. Next slide. So another policy component that's been included in the regulations involves edible food recovery capacity planning. Next slide. As I mentioned before, now that you know who the commercial edible food generators are and that they're required to donate the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed, it's important to then remember that that's going to be a major influx of food. So we need to ensure that we have the appropriate capacity or the necessary capacity to be able to recover the amount of edible food that's going to be available for food recovery. So to address that, CalRecycle included capacity planning requirements in the regulations. So one of the first requirements in that section of the regulations specifies that counties, in collaboration with cities, special districts that provide solid waste collection services, and regional agencies located within the county are required to, number one, estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators that are located within the jurisdiction that are located within the county and jurisdictions within the county. Next slide. Thank you. So once they come up with those estimates, they then need to, they will then know, okay, this is the amount of edible food that's available for food recovery that would have otherwise been disposed. So once they have that information, they then need to consult with their food recovery organizations and services, or collaborate with their food recovery organizations and services to really identify their existing capacity at those organizations they need to identify if there will be what their current capacity is and any proposed new or expanded food recovery capacity. Once they have that information, so they know this is how much will be disposed, this is how much capacity we have available or will be available, they can then compare that and say, okay, do we have sufficient capacity to be able to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed? And if they do not, then they will need to take actions to increase edible food recovery capacity. Next slide. So it's really important to also note that in order to comply with these requirements, jurisdictions will have to consult with food recovery organizations and food recovery services. And any entity that's contacted by the jurisdiction with a request for this information, those entities must respond to the jurisdiction's request within 60 days. Next slide. Going back to something I just said about if the county determines that they do not have sufficient capacity. So if they determine that they do not have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed by the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators, they will then be required to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle. That implementation schedule will need to include timelines and milestones for how they plan to increase capacity to meet their needs. And in order to complete that implementation schedule, they will need to consult with food recovery organizations and food recovery services. Next slide. Another major policy component in the edible food recovery regulations is that jurisdictions will be required to implement local edible food recovery programs. And as part of their program, they will need to educate commercial edible food generators about the commercial edible food generator requirements. They will need to increase commercial edible food generators' access to food recovery organizations and services. This is the enforcement piece that they will need to monitor commercial edible food generator compliance. So enforcement in this is absolutely critical. And then going back to capacity planning, each individual jurisdiction will be required to increase edible food recovery capacity if it is determined that they do not have sufficient capacity to meet their edible food recovery needs. Now, we also included language in this section of the regulations. It is not a requirement, but rather it's language to let jurisdictions know that this is an option for them, and also to encourage them to think about how they could potentially develop a sustainable funding source to help cover their costs of implementing this program. So the language states that a jurisdiction may, we highlight and underline the word may because it's not shall, it's may. A jurisdiction may fund their edible food recovery program through franchise fees, local assessments, or other funding mechanisms. Now I want to bring your attention to franchise fees. I showed you that we have a model food recovery agreement a little earlier. We also have a model franchise agreement, and in that model franchise agreement, it includes different options for building food recovery into the agreement. And the reason why you would do that, there are many reasons, but part of that is to help develop a sustainable funding source for food recovery or for the jurisdiction edible food recovery program, things like that. So that's an option for you. At the end of this presentation, I will show you where all of those tools can be accessed. Next slide. As I mentioned, jurisdictions will be required to educate commercial edible food generator they will be required to educate commercial edible food generators about the requirements that those generators are subject to. That's part of the education and outreach requirements for jurisdictions. They also will be required to develop a list of food recovery organizations and services that are operating in the jurisdiction. They will need to maintain the list on their website and update that list annually. The list will need to include the name, contact information, address, collection service area, if applicable, and the types of food accepted by each food recovery organization or service that they include on the list. Now, I do want to clarify something about this list. We get questions about this, not as often anymore, but we used to during the rulemaking process. So for anyone that might have this question, this is not a requirement to create a list of all the food recovery organizations and services operating in your jurisdiction. jurisdiction. The requirement is just to develop a list. So it's at the discretion of the jurisdiction to determine which organizations and services are most appropriate to include on their list. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. Also, as part of the jurisdiction edible food recovery program, jurisdictions will be required to monitor commercial edible food generator compliance. So each jurisdiction must have an enforcement and inspection program that includes inspections to verify that the generator does have a contract or written agreement with the food recovery organization or service pursuant to SB 1383, and that the commercial edible food generators are maintaining records. Now, I didn't go over the record keeping requirements in this presentation, but it's important to note that they do have record keeping requirements. These inspections must begin for Tier 1 generators in 2022 and Tier 2 in 2024. It's also important to note, so I'd bring your attention to the green bar at the bottom of the slide, that these inspections can be combined with mandatory inspections that already exist. So there's nothing that prohibits a jurisdiction from contracting with their local health department, for example, to comply with some or all of the edible food recovery requirements. Just know that if you did contract with your local health department and you're the jurisdiction, that the the jurisdiction is ultimately the entity that's responsible for compliance. Next slide. So the final policy component that I'm going to cover in today's presentation involves the requirements for food recovery organizations and services. Any food recovery organization or service that enters into a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator pursuant to SB 1383 will be required to maintain records and to report certain information. For record keeping, they will need to maintain a record of the name, address, and contact information for each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator that they've established a contract with pursuant to SB 1383. They will also need to maintain a record of the pounds of edible food collected from each of those generators per month. For reporting, it's a little bit different. So they have these records, but for reporting, any food recovery organization that has established a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator pursuant to SB 1383 will be required to report the total pounds collected from Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators that they contract with pursuant to SB 1383 to the jurisdiction. Now it gets a little bit more in-depth than that. They need to report the total pounds collected only from Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators to one jurisdiction, and that is the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located. So just as a recap, they're only reporting the total pounds collected to one jurisdiction. There is no reporting of donor names. This is very important. We have received concerns from our key stakeholders in the food recovery space. They are worried that they would be required to report proprietary food donation or food donor data, and that is not the case. They are only required to report total pounds collected in the previous calendar year, and they will have that information because they are required to maintain records of it. Next slide. So some key dates regarding edible food recovery and SB 1383. As of 2022, jurisdictions will be required to establish their edible food recovery programs. The Tier 1 commercial edible food generators must be compliant. Jurisdictions will begin food recovery capacity planning. They will also begin their education and outreach, which will be conducted on an annual basis. Jurisdictions will also begin their inspections of Tier 1 generators and food recovery organizations and services. Starting in 2024, so 2 years later, the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators must be compliant. Jurisdictions will then begin their inspections of the Tier 2 generators, and they will take enforcement action against non-compliant entities. Next slide. So with that, we thank you for your time, and we'd be happy to take any of your questions now.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Martine. Very well done. So this is Julia with CalRecycle. I just want to give everyone a quick reminder of how the Q&A session will go. So again, to ask a question, if you're watching via the broadcast, please send us an email to the SLCP inbox. If you are in the GoToWebinar platform, please type in your question into the question pane. We will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. And just a reminder that you will need to unmute yourself on your end to ask your question, and please state your affiliation. So with that, we will go to our first question, and it looks like the first 3 or so are from Edgar. So Edgar, I am unmuting you right now, so you can go ahead and ask your questions. And Edgar, you're self-muted, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you. Yes, well, my other questions have already been answered. There's just one that I'm trying to get answered, and that one is, apologies, Edgar with the City of Reading. The one question that's missing is, I'm trying to get a grasp of, for the reporting aspect for food organizations, if an organization, for example, say a food bank recovers food from more than one city jurisdiction, so let's say the food bank here is responsible and the designated Feed in America food bank for the county, but they receive food not only from the City of Reading, even though their main hub is the City of Reading, do they have to report just based on City of Reading donors in terms of what is food, or can they just report to us all the information, meaning the pounds of food gathered from the county itself, or do they have to separate city versus county?
Thank you for your question, Edgar. If I think I understand it. So because the edible food recovery goal is a statewide goal, and we don't place numeric targets on any county or jurisdiction where they need to achieve a certain edible food recovery rate, to make things as efficient as possible, both for the entity responsible for reporting and for jurisdictions, what we require is, if you have a contract or written agreement with generators and they're in many different jurisdictions, that's fine. You report the total pounds collected from those entities to the jurisdiction, one jurisdiction where your primary address is physically located. So it's very possible, absolutely, that one jurisdiction will get a report with pounds that have been recovered from all over the region, but that's fine, because what we're looking at is overall as a state, how much have we recovered? Now, on the other hand, what you could see then is, as a jurisdiction, oh, this is a food bank and they're recovering a lot of food. It's very possible that they're recovering from many jurisdictions. We don't know. They only had to report the total pounds collected, but they're recovering so much food. Maybe we should include them on our list of food recovery organizations and services, since they seem to be doing such a good job. Maybe we should find a way to help them think through sustainable funding for their operations, or include them in our local food recovery program. So that reporting data can give you some good insights into who is recovering the most food in your city. But of course, keeping in mind, just like you said, they probably are collecting that food from generators that are across the region, not just in one jurisdiction. So did I answer your question?
You did, and thank you. I just want to follow up on that. So would it have to be up to the jurisdiction and or the food bank that I brought up in the example, who they report to avoid double counting of that edible food recovery?
Yeah, so wonderful question. Part of the reason why we only required reporting to one jurisdiction is specifically to avoid double counting. So it isn't up to the food bank to decide which jurisdiction they want to report to. It's whatever jurisdiction their primary physical address is located in, that's who they report to. So even, let's say they're located in one jurisdiction, but they don't even recover food from any generators in that jurisdiction. They recover food in different areas. They still have to report only to the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much, Edgar. And just for the benefit of the folks who are listening through the CalRecycle broadcast and cannot see the answers we've responded to in writing, I'm just going to read two of the other questions that you did ask, and I'll have Kyle and Martine answer those just very briefly for us. So Edgar also asked, a jurisdiction may fund their program through franchise fees, local assessments, or other funding mechanisms. So what is CalRecycle doing? So what CalRecycle is doing, in short, is passing on the cost to consumers. So Kyle or Martine, can you just respond to that very quickly for those on the broadcast?
Yeah, I can respond to that. And Edgar, thank you for your question. I think I responded to a few of them in here, and happy to provide additional clarification too. But on the funding portion of it, as I mentioned in my response, that is permissive language that's in there. We don't require that funding, but if local governments do choose to fund this program, which I hope they do, and that develops into sustainable funding mechanisms, they can come in all different shapes and sizes. So, you know, whether that's directly passed on to the consumer or through some other mechanism, I don't have an answer for that, but those types of models we see kind of expanding, and hope to highlight them as they evolve here. So it's not specific on whether that's directly passed on to a consumer. Hopefully that helps. And Martine, add to that if I missed something.
Yeah, and I'm sorry guys if I look really dark in the camera. I'm trying to get more light on me, but so sorry about that. But I have a couple of thoughts regarding that. If, for example, you were building food recovery into a franchise agreement, you would not be able to have the rate increase for consumers that aren't benefiting from that program, food recovery program. So you'd be providing the service, and you could even do it on a voluntary basis, saying, this is a service that we offer. We've partnered with a food recovery organization. Would you like to donate your food? If you accept this, then it would increase your rate slightly. Like, that's one example of what we're seeing throughout the state, or in certain areas of the state. But something else that's really important, because I think it's a little dangerous to say we're passing on the cost to the consumer. When you think about the food that needs to be rescued, it needs to be rescued because a business or a certain entity generated this food. And something happened along the line where this food then needed to be recovered. And if it is not recovered, it's going to go to waste. That's not the fault of the food recovery organization that hasn't even come to collect the food. And I'm not going to say that it's the fault of the generator, but food waste happens. Surplus edible food needs to be recovered. So as much as we can find ways to sustainably fund this and not have all of the costs go onto the food recovery organization, that's going to be amazing towards moving the needle on sustainable funding for food rescue in this state. And that's why that model food recovery agreement is also so important, because it includes different options for cost sharing. And I'm happy you brought up this question, because in full transparency, this is my second presentation of the day. So I thought that there was a slide on where to find the model tools in this presentation, and I apologize for that. The model food recovery agreement and the model franchise agreement can all be found on CalRecycle's education and outreach page. And if you scroll down towards the bottom of the page, those tools will be there.
Great, thank you very much. That definitely clarifies the question. I was coming at it from a different angle, but now I see what angle you were taking. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Edgar.
And then thank you, Kyle and Martine. The one other question, if you could please respond to again out loud for those of the broadcast, is how do you distinguish between a city and county as far as jurisdiction requirements? Are they mutually exclusive, or can they overlap?
Kara, are you on the call?
I am. Hey, thanks so much for the question. So Kyle noted the regulations do have a definition of jurisdiction, and that is a county, a city or county, which is San Francisco, or a special district that provides solid waste collection services. When you read the regulations, you'll note that if it refers to jurisdiction, then it's referencing all of those types of jurisdictions in the definition. If the regulation is mentioning a specific type of jurisdiction, then it is specifically addressing that type. So for example, later you'll hear today on the procurement requirements for organic waste procurement, product procurement, it doesn't reference all of the jurisdiction types. So I hope that answered the question. Let us know if it didn't.
I'll just say, Kara, that was so much better than my response. Well done. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Caitlin. Caitlin, if you could please unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Looks like, okay, go.
Hi there. Yes, my name is Caitlin. I work with Santa Barbara County. My question is regarding county jails. I would personally have considered them to be more similarly aligned with state agencies with cafeterias, and I'm curious to hear what your definition of a county jail would be in the sense of tiers 1 and tiers 2s.
Sure. Hey, just to put in a plug for some tools that'll be coming out, probably looking at early April, we do have guidance on identifying tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators, and this particular question is addressed in that guidance. So to answer your question, a county jail would not fit in the definition of a state agency with a cafeteria of 250 or more seats or 5,000 square feet. A county jail is a county department and not a state agency. Does that answer your question?
I'm curious if, so does that mean that it would not be considered a tier 1 or a tier 2, or is it a tier 1? Yeah,
so likely it would be neither. So the way you have to look at the definitions and when you're identifying tier 1 or tier 2 is you look at, does it fit any of the other definitions? So we just answered that it's not a state agency with a cafeteria of 250 or more seats, 5,000 square feet. It's not any of the others like supermarket, grocery store, food service provider, wholesale food vendor. So then you would look at it if it had a restaurant that met the definition in the tier 2 definition. We're not aware of any of the county jails that have a restaurant that meets that size. But that if it had a restaurant on site, then that restaurant potentially could be a tier 2. But just the fact of a county jail providing food for the inmates would not. You could potentially have a situation where there's a food service provider that meets the definition in the tier 1, but that food service provider would be the entity that would have the requirements to recover edible food. So most cases we're finding in talking to various stakeholders, we haven't seen any county jails that fit either tier 1 or tier 2 definition. Martine, Kyle, anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you got it, Kara. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So our next question is coming from Rick. Rick, you are unmuted. You can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, thank you for having this webinar. There's just so much information that a jurisdiction has to come through. This is Rick Encarnacion from Monterey County. My question is, just trying to get everything together. It would help that if there's like a template self-audit tools that a jurisdiction could utilize. So aside from the model agreements, are there tools that you have or are developing that would help us begin with the end in mind, so to speak, so that we could kind of build off of what you would eventually be looking for when we're audited?
Kyle, do you want to start or do you want?
Well, I can jump in a little bit on this. I'm not sure if I understand, Rick, and thank you for the question. Thank you for the thank you too. Appreciate that. On the self-audit tools and what that means, I will say that, and Kara mentioned this or referenced a little bit earlier, we are working on other tools for capacity planning efforts that will help jurisdictions sort through that, some guidance there. And those will be on the way in early April, as Kara mentions. What else would you guys like to add to that?
So I'll chime in, and Rick, let me know if I'm off base. But you said something that CalRecycle may use when we do like our audit or our compliance evaluation. We'll have, and Alan is on the phone too right now for our compliance and enforcement, but we will have sample record keeping, as well as we're going to be modifying what reporting looks like. So Alan's team, he's working on an electronic record keeping document, which is an optional use because there's different flexibilities within the regs on record keeping, but Alan's team is working on something like that. So that's kind of a guidance or tool that you could use of what we would be looking for when we're identifying or reviewing your record keeping requirements. And then we're also modifying if there's reporting requirements on the aspects that you're talking about. We are modifying our reports. They should, hopefully, we should have an idea maybe summer, fall of what the 2022 reports will look like. But for all of those things, we'll have supplemental webinars to walk you through those too. So I don't know if that helps also, but I did hear you wanted to see something that kind of mimicked what we would be looking at. So let me know if I'm off base on that.
Yeah, kind of, because we're a jurisdiction. Like when you say a jurisdiction or a county, and then because like for instance in environmental health, which I'm a part of, we're audited by state agencies for the programs that we regulate, because we do the things that need to happen in order to meet the objective. And this bill, this whole program, it's huge, it's massive. There's multiple agencies involved. I was the one that asked the question about, when you say jurisdiction, who does it refer to? And that's important for us here in Monterey County, or all jurisdictions, because there is no 1383 agency. There is no 1383 local czar, right? So in order for us to get organized, it would help, like if aside from the existing tools that you're providing, what is it that will be eventually be assessed at, aside from like, okay, we're going to use the 2014, 2018 levels. All right, that's huge in itself. But what is it that we need to do in order, like even like a simple checklist, or that kind of helps the jurisdictions identify who within our jurisdiction would be in charge of a certain aspect of it. And then in totality, because it's going to be the jurisdiction, and in our case, Monterey County, that has to comply, that, if there's something tangible that we can have aside from trying to figure it out along the way, because 2022 is right around the corner. This COVID didn't help. It's like COVID was kind of like a time machine for us. All of a sudden, it's 2021. So if there is a template audit that we're expected to drive towards, aside from the meeting the levels, that would help.
Got it. I get it now, I think. So I don't know if Rob or Tracy wants to chime in as well, but HF&H did create kind of a handy dandy checklist. We don't have it on our website, but HF&H does. So Rob and Tracy, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
This is Tracy. Hi again. We do have a checklist. We'd be happy to share that with people. I don't think we have it up on our website, so you probably need to email Tracy at hfh-consultants.com, and we could type that into the answer box. You could certainly reach out to me and I will share that with you. And that runs, it covers like high level. It's I think a 1 or 2 page checklist of like the key things that you need to be focusing on as a jurisdiction, whether a city or a county.
Right, thank you.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything helps.
Yeah, and then Ashley, I'd just like to chime in. I think what I'd like to do is have our local assistance liaison follow up, because I know we are doing work with Monterey County And so let's do offline chat and make sure that we are communicating with all the affected departments. Last thing I wanted to say is what we have been doing across the state is we've been presenting to Board of Supervisors for counties and city councils to help explain the myriad of requirements that a jurisdiction has to do. And when we have that conversation, we talk about the different departments that are affected or could be affected and that need to be assigned some of these activities, and the staff that need to be informed about how some of these requirements might affect, you know, what they're responsible for. So I'd love to do a follow-up, and we'll have a team member connect with you. If you wouldn't mind just putting your contact information in the Q&A, we'll do a follow-up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Emily. Emily, if you could please unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi, I'm assuming I'm the correct Emily.
Yes.
So my question, I'm from the SLO Food Bank in San Luis Obispo, and my question is there any work to talk to grocery stores or food producers about adjusting the way they order or produce food? Much of the work needed to decrease food waste is not just about finding ways to divert it, but to not create as much to begin with.
I'll take that one. Emily, that's a great question. And I do have some information for all of you on that one. Look up the Pacific Coast Collaborative, and I'll tell you just briefly about that. That is an effort with us in California here, some municipalities within California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland have been actively participating in that, open to others as well, but and Oregon and Washington, also British Columbia, too, are working with several organizations. One is the World Wildlife Fund, the other is ReFed, and then also WRAP out of the UK, to work directly with grocery retail and the supply chains that feed that grocery retail to really look closely at supply chain and see where food waste and loss is occurring. And so that work is actively beginning now, and starts looking at important supply chains like dairy, the dairy industry, and how grocery receives that. Are there ways to improve some of those efficiencies? And that's really modeled after work that was done in the UK. And I won't go on too much more, but just to let you know, that focal point is grocery retail, with hopes to expand in the future into hospitality sectors, maybe healthcare as well, to start tackling source reduction when we talk about food waste. We know that's such a huge issue, and really the best way from a climate perspective to tackle food waste in California. We need to prevent it, then we need to rescue it, then we need to recover it for beneficial use. So great question. Happy to talk more offline about that one.
And Emily, one additional thing I do want to add, because your question is arguably one of the most important questions when it comes to food waste in general. How can we prevent the generation of it to begin with? When it came to SB 1383 and the development of these regulations, we absolutely would have included prevention regulations if something about how California needs to prevent the creation of food waste, some kind of statutory requirement was included in the law of SB 1383. And so the reason why I bring this up is because for everyone on the call, if we want to see this happen in California, we need legislation that requires it. And unfortunately, 1383 didn't specify that food waste needs to be prevented. Now, we tried to find ways to build source reduction into these regulations in a way that we had the authority to do. But I just really want to thank you for your question, because that's absolutely critical. And another thing to keep in mind is if we can prevent surplus food from being generated and prevent the creation of food waste, that really reduces the impact, or sorry, it reduces the need to expand capacity as much as we currently need to. And so it's absolutely critical. And again, I just want to say thank you for bringing that up.
And Martine, you sparked one more thought. We have, over the course of last year, been able to fund food waste prevention and rescue projects through our California Climate Investment Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program. And so there are some really glowing examples out there. San Diego Food System Alliance is a good one that has been funded to do work, not necessarily directly with grocery retail, but other source reduction activities. And there are others too. So be aware of that. We hope, fingers crossed, we can get future funding to do more of that work. Thanks.
All right, thank you all so much. So our next question is coming from Agnes. Agnes, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, I just wanted to get some clarification on what size events are included as tier 2, and whether, street events are included as opposed to events that are at event centers. So if you could just clarify what tier 2 events are, that would be great. Thank you.
Kara, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. So let me just say what I put into the chat. So the definition of a large event, there are a couple of key pieces to the definition. So what it does mean is it's an event, can be a sporting event, flea market, or a festival. The key is that it charges an admission price or is operated by a local agency and serves an average of more than 2,000 individuals per day of operation of the event. And so it can be at a location that can include a public, nonprofit, or privately owned park, a parking lot, a golf course, a street system, or other open space when being used for an event. So those are the parameters in which you would look at, your the particular scenario. But that key is charging an admission price. So do you have any more details about your particular scenario?
I'm thinking about Car Week events actually, and which ones of those, if you guys are sort of would be pulled under, and whether any events that could be big events but don't serve that much food, how would we sort of pull those out versus sort of focusing on the ones that are really going to be generators.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you had a large event that met the definition, the 2,000 people charging a fee, and there was absolutely no food being served, then you would not include them as a tier 2 generator. I'm not sure that there'll be events like that, but I suppose you could have that particular scenario.
Well, there's some city events that might be pretty close to that because they don't have to charge a fee if it's a city event, right?
Right, correct. Mm-hmm.
So we have one city event that might be sort of on a gray area, and we can work with our CalRecycle rep on that.
Yeah, let's do a follow-up on that, and we can explore it, and then we'll line it up against the definition.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Jill. Jill, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question.
Hi. I didn't think you were I just typed my question and I didn't think you were going to make me get on here and actually ask. I'm embarrassed. Hi, everyone. I'm trying to find my question. What agreements do you have a template? Maybe you should come back to me.
Do you want me to read it for you, Jill?
if you like? Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to find it in the Sorry, I'm like teaching my kid how to write an essay and, listening to this webinar. Sorry.
I can go ahead and read this. I'll just say, multitasking in this new age, I can understand. I can relate. You said smaller pantries that work under a large food bank, they do not need to report individually, but could allow the food bank to report for them.
Yes. Okay. So
Are you asking if the food bank could aggregate that reporting for them?
Well, so like for instance, in our county, there's a lot of smaller food banks that just basically operate under this umbrella of the food bank, and they do a lot of the reporting. They use the Meal Connect software to do all the reporting. So the individual pantries I know would be like, no, I don't want to send my reports to each individual jurisdiction. So I was just wondering if in that case where you have small pantries that are using like Meal Connect software, they already are doing some kind of aggregation of their data. Is that the way to do it, or do you really want each individual pantry to report?
Yeah, Martine, do you want to jump in? You can start. I can add to this. We've been asked this question too.
Yeah, I can start. So really, if it's a small food pantry and first, Jill, it's Jill Santos, right?
Oh yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I had to check. But hi, it's great to hear your voice and that you're on the webinar. Yeah, if it's the only entities that are required to report are those that have established a contract or written agreement with one of these generators pursuant to SB 1383. So if they haven't done that, and they're just picking up food that the food bank says, hey, can you go and get this? They don't have that contract, then nothing would require them to report. Now, with that said, there are going to be some situations where, let's say, it might be a larger food pantry where they do have a contract or written agreement with a generator, and they're also working with the food bank. These are some things that we're currently looking into. We've gotten this question before about where the reporting would occur. So we're trying to figure out currently if it would be appropriate for the food bank to still aggregate all of that data and then report at the food bank level. The concern there, we've heard concerns from other stakeholders that then that could give the food bank, and this is just something we have heard from stakeholders, we are not saying it, not CalRecycle, but the concern was that that could give the food bank kind of a monopoly over the food and the generators. And that's something that they did not want to see. They're worried that the smaller organizations won't have the opportunity then to establish those contracts and written agreements. Now, we are policymakers. We're not doing the boots on the ground food recovery work, although we try to get out there as much as possible to do food recovery, go on food recovery ride-alongs. That's something we really need to look into more about. How would that play out? Is it really appropriate for the food bank to do all the reporting? So the answer right now is, first and foremost, the regulations require, if you have a contract or written agreement with a generator, you have to report. With that said, in terms of if the food bank wants to do all of that reporting, we need to talk to our legal team and get back to you.
Great. Yeah, it almost seems like the jurisdiction might benefit from purchasing some kind of software program that makes it easy for the food banks and the food pantries to report individually rather than try to aggregate, maybe. Okay, thank you for that. I don't want to take up more time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill.
All right, thank you everyone so much for asking your questions. Thank you, Martine, Kyle, Karen, Ashley for your responses. So this is Julia. We're gonna have to move on now to our procurement presentation. I just wanna mention that we will still be responding to questions in writing for the edible food questions that came in through the GoToWebinar platform. And if you asked a question via the SLCB inbox, we will get back to you at a later date with a response. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Dewey and Kristen Pidcock for their presentation on the procurement requirements.
Thank you so much, Julia. Pleasure to be here today. Today, I will be giving you a brief overview of the procurement requirements outlined in the SB 1383 regulations. As we want to leave the bulk of today's session open for Q&A, this slideshow is a bit condensed. However, if you need further information on the procurement requirements, please feel free to check out our webpage, contact us with any questions, and of course, answer questions during today's Q&A. The procurement requirements are designed to help build the markets for the products coming out of organics recycling facilities and to help close the loop on recovering and actually using the organic waste that will be diverted as a result of SB 1383. So today I'll discuss two distinct procurement requirements for jurisdictions: to procure recovered organic waste products and recycled content paper. First, we'll talk about recovered organic waste products. These are shown here and include mulch, compost, energy products from anaerobic digestion, including transportation fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating, and electricity from biomass conversion. The regulations do outline specific details as to what makes these products eligible for procurement, but the key is that these products are made from California landfill diverted organic waste and that they are made at specific types of facilities or operations in California. Jurisdictions are required to undertake this procurement. So for the procurement of recovered organic waste products, jurisdictions are defined as cities, counties, or cities and counties. So how much of these products does each city or county need to procure? CalRecycle will assign an annual procurement target to each jurisdiction based on their population. The formula you see here is from our regulations and demonstrates how a jurisdiction's procurement target is calculated and how conversion factors are then used to convert this target into quantities of end products. So a jurisdiction's population is multiplied by a per capita procurement factor defined in the regulations as 0.08 tons of organic waste per person, and the result is a jurisdiction's procurement target measured in tons of organic waste. And every 5 years, a jurisdiction's procurement target will be recalculated to account for changes in their population. The regulations then outline conversion factors that are used to convert the jurisdiction's procurement targets into actual quantities of recovered organic waste products. So to determine how much of these end quantities a jurisdiction needs to procure, their target is multiplied by these conversion factors. We did build in multiple options into the procurement requirements to help provide jurisdictions with flexibility in meeting their procurement target. And in keeping with this theme, jurisdictions can customize their procurement and can choose what mix of products they'd like to procure to meet their target. So they can meet their target entirely through one product or through a mix of products. This slide further highlights some additional procurement options that were built into the regulations. First off, jurisdictions can meet their procurement target either through direct procurement, in which the jurisdiction is directly procuring and using the product themselves or giving it away, or they can meet their target through a direct service provider, in which a city or county has a contract or written agreement with an external entity, such as a hauler or contractor, to procure those eligible products on behalf of the jurisdiction. So an example of this could be is if a city contracted with a landscaping company to use eligible mulch or compost products and requires in that contract that the products meet the regulatory requirements and that they're being procured on behalf of the city, this could count towards the city's procurement target. Some important things to emphasize are that procurement does not necessarily mean purchase. A jurisdiction that produces its own eligible products or receives it in another way, such as free delivery of compost, for example, from a contracted hauler, and then uses that product, can count this towards their target. And it's also important to note that procurement can be what we call a paper transaction. So the products that are procured do not have to be actually produced within the jurisdiction, made from their own collected organic waste, or even used within the jurisdiction. So a jurisdiction in theory could purchase eligible compost from anywhere in the state and use this towards their procurement target. Lastly, CalRecycle has built a mechanism into the regulations where a jurisdiction's procurement target can be lowered to ensure that a jurisdiction does not procure more products than it can use. So this was included because the intent of these requirements is not to force jurisdictions to purchase more than they have a need for. A jurisdiction may qualify for an adjusted procurement target if their calculated procurement target exceeds their previous year's procurement of energy products. So it would be their previous year's procurement of transportation fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating. If those quantities do not hit their their calculated procurement target, then they may qualify for a reduced target. This mechanism is triggered by a jurisdiction as part of their annual report, and a jurisdiction must keep records and report to CalRecycle the amount of these energy products procured in that previous calendar year to support the use of a reduced target. This slide shows just a few examples of how a jurisdiction might use these products to meet their goals. So for compost and mulch, we may be seeing this used for things such as erosion control, as a soil amendment or cover in city parks, open spaces or gardens. A city or county could also host compost or mulch giveaways, and this can count towards their target. A jurisdiction may use renewable transportation fuel to fuel things such as their own buses or waste fleets. They could also have a contracted direct service provider relationship with an external entity, such as a franchise waste hauler, to procure and use these products on their behalf. So a hauler using eligible fuel in their trucks, for example. A jurisdiction can use renewable gas for any heating needs. So we may see this being used for things such as on-site needs of heating or cooking, or to heat equipment such as the digesters themselves. And electricity from biomass conversion or from renewable gas from anaerobic digestion could be used to power any needs for the jurisdiction, such as on-site needs at the organics recycling facility itself, or any other buildings or infrastructure used by the jurisdiction or their direct service providers. Jurisdictions are required to maintain records so that CalRecycle can verify compliance as needed. There are a variety of records included and outlined in the regulations, and these include things such as the name, physical location, and contact information of the entities from whom products were procured, a general description of how products were used, invoices or similar records of procurement, and this does encompass procurement by the jurisdiction and through their direct service provider. And there are additional record keeping requirements outlined in the regulations that are specific for certain products procured, including mulch and energy products from wastewater treatment facilities or from biomass conversion. So do take note of that. And the second part of the procurement requirements are for the procurement of recycled content paper. And these are entirely separate from the recovered organic waste product requirements we've discussed so far. Unlike the requirements discussed so far, the requirements for recycled content paper are a blanket requirement for all paper purchases. So there is no target of how much needs to be purchased. Rather, all purchases must meet these requirements. And another important distinction for these requirements are that it does include a broader scope of jurisdictions that are subject to these requirements. So it is not just cities, counties, or cities and counties who are subject to these requirements, but also special districts that provide solid waste collection services. SB 1383 does build upon existing requirements, which many local entities already meet, such as to purchase minimum recycled content paper products and printing and writing papers. But some new requirements that are added are that paper purchases must also be recyclable under the Federal Trade Commission guidance. So this means that a substantial majority of the population where these paper products are being sold do have access to recycling programs for those products at the end of their useful life. And another requirement added is that jurisdictions must also require the vendors from whom they purchase these products to provide certifications of the minimum post-consumer recycled content of these products and that these products meet this recyclability requirement. And there are a variety of examples of paper products and printing and writing papers included in our definition in the regulations. So please do take a look at that, but it includes things such as paper, janitorial supplies, cartons, packaging, file folders, envelopes, and most printing and writing papers. So do take a look at that regulatory text. And there are also record keeping requirements for recycled content paper purchases. This will include copies of invoices, receipts, or other proofs of purchase that describes the procurement, and those copies of certifications or verifications from their vendors that are documenting the minimum post-consumer content requirement and that these products are recyclable. This slide gives a timeline for SB 1383 implementation, and you'll see here in red are some important dates for procurement. The procurement requirements do become enforceable in 2022 with the rest of the regs. There is one delay for implementation for rural counties and for jurisdictions who are located within rural counties who are exempt from the organic waste collection requirements. These entities will not be required to comply with the recovered organic waste product procurement requirements until January of 2027. However, all jurisdictions, including rural jurisdictions, will be required to comply with the recycled content paper procurement requirements in 2022. And jurisdictions will be informed annually of their procurement target through posting on CalRecycle's website and through direct written notification. Jurisdictions can certainly calculate their procurement targets now through the formula outlined in the regulations. However, their official procurement target for 2022 will be taking into account newer population data than is currently available. We do expect this data to be available in May of this year, and so CalRecycle will be providing notice to jurisdictions of their official targets following the release of this data. And there are requirements included in Article 13 of the regulations for jurisdictions to report annually to CalRecycle to demonstrate compliance with the SB 1383 regulations. There is a one-time initial compliance report for jurisdictions who are planning on procuring mulch. The regulations outline that if a jurisdiction is to procure mulch to meet their requirements, they need to adopt an ordinance or other enforceable mechanism requiring that mulch meet a variety of requirements outlined. So if a jurisdiction is procuring mulch, there is this one-time reporting of this adopted ordinance. However, all other reporting will take place through annual reporting on the dates listed here. And this reporting will include the amount of each recovered organic waste product procured during the previous calendar year. And if a jurisdiction is implementing one of those reduced procurement targets, they will also need to report to CalRecycle those quantities of energy products procured in that previous calendar year prior to the compliance year. Lastly, this slide highlights some of the tools and resources currently available to help jurisdictions implement the procurement requirements. The procurement calculator tool was released on our website and through our listserv a few months back and can be used by jurisdictions to calculate their procurement targets and the quantities of recovered organic waste products they'll need to procure to meet this target. So it might be helpful in planning for procurement and in tracking a jurisdiction's progress towards meeting their targets. We did host a webinar on this tool in February, but it was recorded in case you missed it. We hope to post this on our website soon, and if you are signed up through our SLCP listserv, you will get a notification of an announcement when this is posted. We also have a model procurement policy, which is a customizable template for jurisdictions who are planning to develop and adopt a procurement policy, and can be customized to reflect what specific products a jurisdiction plans to procure. So that is another resource available on our website. We also have case studies on procurement that highlight jurisdictions that are already taking actions towards compliance, and additional resources and informational content on our website with more under development. So please let us know if there's any resources you'd like to see highlighted on our website, as we are in the process of continually developing guidance and resources and would like to provide the best tools to help our cities and counties comply. So that's it for my presentation. Please be sure you are signed up for our SLCP listserv to stay up to date on all developments. This presentation was a fairly quick overview, so we're looking forward to questions you have today, and if we can't get to you today, please do check out our website and contact us with any questions you have. We're really excited for this opportunity to hear from our Central Coast stakeholders today. I'm sure there'll be a number of out-of-the-box scenarios or questions with a lot of nuance that we potentially haven't considered. So some of these we may need to take offline and get back to you at a later date, but we will be sure to do that if that's the case. And for today's Q&A session, as you may have heard, we won't be addressing the merits or reasoning behind the language that was developed in regulations, as we do really want to focus on our implementation and clarification questions during this limited Q&A time we have. And before we open up the floor, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Kristen Pidcock, who will touch on a number of our most frequently asked questions we regularly address. And this will hopefully address some of your questions you may have off the bat and hopefully guide some of your questions for today's Q&A. So thank you so much for listening in, and please take it away, Kristen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. My name is Kristen Pidcock, and yes, we are excited for the opportunity to hear your thoughts and your questions today. As Michelle said, I'm going to go over a couple of our commonly asked questions that we receive about procurement. So I will just jump right in. The first question is, how can a jurisdiction meet their procurement target? So for example, if a jurisdiction's organic waste is going to a compost facility, does that count towards procurement? And the regulations outline that procurement is achieved through the end use or giveaway of recovered organic waste products. So simply diverting your waste to a compost facility doesn't meet the procurement requirements. The intent of procurement is to encourage the demand and use of these products, which helps close the loop, and because this is where the most environmental benefits are realized. So how these end products are being used is really the focus of procurement. Another question we receive regarding what can count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target is when there is an entity in a jurisdiction that's using recovered organic waste products. And an example of this would be if a local waste hauler is fueling its trucks with eligible transportation fuel derived from renewable gas, can that count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target? And in that situation, it could be eligible, but there would need to be an established direct service provider relationship for this to be an option. Michelle had touched on this a little in her presentation. So this means there would need to be a written agreement or a contract in place between the jurisdiction and the end user defining the direct service provider relationship and how they would be procuring on the jurisdiction's behalf. So if there's not that written agreement and a relationship established, then that external entity is not considered part of the jurisdiction, and this would not count towards the procurement target. The next question is, in what circumstances does mulch count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? And mulch is eligible as a procurement product if it meets the requirements outlined in the regulations. So among other things, the mulch must be produced at specific permitted facilities, and it must comply with land application standards. And the requirement for it to be produced at these permitted facilities is to ensure that these products are being made from diverted solid waste, as well as helping support the landfill diversion goals of SB 1383. And you may have also noticed that chipping and grinding operations are excluded, and this is because the feedstocks typically entering these types of facilities are not considered diverted as, they're not considered as landfill diverted materials. So our last question is, under what circumstances can gas produced at a POTW or publicly owned wastewater treatment facility count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? And there are several requirements outlined in the regulations, but the key to remember here is that this renewable gas must be produced from landfill diverted organic waste. So the water treatment facility would need to be accepting eligible diverted organics from specific permitted solid waste facilities, and then the portion of the gas produced from those diverted organics is what may count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. And with that, those are just a few frequently asked questions we get, and now we're going to transition into the open Q&A session. We've got our whole team here to help answer your questions. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to give it back to Julie to get us started.
All right, thank you so much, Kristen and Michelle, as usual. So our first question is from Edgar. Edgar, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thank you. I have two questions that I asked. I'll ask them next, back to back. The first one is, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that direct service agreements could count towards procurement if, for example, a jurisdiction produces compost and another one doesn't produce compost, and that's how we could meet this procurement target. If that's correct, if so, could you elaborate on that? And the second question is, when is the FAQ page for SB 1383 going to be back up and running?
So Michelle, I could jump in for the FAQs really quickly before you go into the rest of the procurement stuff. So we took them down to update, and they should be up sometime shortly, but I would just check back. And we could also let you know when they're back up, and we'll probably send out a listserv announcement. I'm just not sure if we're for sure doing that because we already sent one out, but we'll for sure contact you when they're back up.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question, Edgar, and I'll take a stab at your first question. So procurement can be achieved through what we call direct procurement, in which the city or county is directly procuring and using that product, or through a direct service provider. And so that would be an example where a jurisdiction has a contract or written agreement for that direct service provider, for that external entity, to use the product on their behalf and to procure on their behalf. So it sounds like in your example, you're wondering if they could procure from a different jurisdiction. If they're not producing their own compost, could they purchase it, for example, or receive it from another jurisdiction? And you're wondering if that is an example of a direct service provider relationship. It sounds like it's not quite with a direct service provider relationship if the jurisdiction is the one procuring and using that product. They would be directly procuring in that instance. The product does not have to be made in a jurisdiction's own, in their own area to count. So they could certainly procure it from another part of the state as long as it's eligible. But however, a direct provider relationship would come into play when there is another entity involved that's not a city or a county who is contracted with that city or county to use that product on their behalf. And they could certainly use it. They could certainly use products that are being produced in other parts of the state as long as they're eligible. Hopefully that answers your question.
The key things are for direct service provider is the entity procuring and using the material on behalf of the jurisdiction that's going to take claim that as part of their compliance record? And is it contracted, is a contract or written agreement that outlines those terms? And does it meet all of the other requirements? It's eligible material from eligible facilities. It's one of the eligible procurement products, etc. So it could be. It depends on the details.
So if I might add, I guess trying to clarify. So let's say, for example, we produce our own compost, but let's say after we meet the target, or we can't meet the target in terms of procurement, we use compost for city facilities, city parks, and all that stuff, and we might even give some away. Even then, we still don't meet our target. Let's say a jurisdiction right next to us says, hey, could we use some of your compost? Are we able to use the compost that we may or may not get to the other jurisdiction as procurement if we ourselves don't use it within our own jurisdiction? Or is that not it?
If the other jurisdiction is a direct service provider to your jurisdiction and it meets all those requirements that I outlined, it could be that could work. I don't see it just depends. It just all the relevant requirements would have to be met.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from James Dunbar. James, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. The name is Jim Dunbar with a company called ListTech International. A question which I put in writing. We produce a liquid-based biofertilizer from diverted organics from landfills, but it's not called compost. So how can we get our produced product considered a procurement product for the sake of this regulation?
Thanks for the question. I know we've, I think either you or other representatives of your organization have spoke in the past at some of the other workshops, but you know, right now, and the regulations are what they are. They list the eligible products and the eligible sources of those products. And so if you've determined that your product is not one of those, and there's no current way of adding additional products to as an eligible product for Article 12 jurisdiction procurement, that would require additional regulation and potentially enabling statute for us to be able to do that.
So that would mean there's only one product available that's in a dry form, that's compost.
So the eligible products, jurisdiction can procure any combination and any portfolio of all of the eligible products, including compost, mulch, various energy products, all outlined in the regulation.
Right. Well, mulch by design is strictly just chopped wood, so it's not filtered with food waste or other types of broken down. But okay, I guess that answers the question. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the question, and thank you, Scott. Our next question is from Bob Nelson. Bob, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question. Okay. Oh, Bob, are you there?
Yes, I am. We process our yard waste into a mulch, and then we pay to have a local farmer take this and use it in his on-site composting operation. He uses the material on his own farm. Would that be able to be counted for our procurement tonnage?
Thanks for your question, Bob. So the regulations, they do outline some specific requirements that will need to be met for products to be eligible. So for mulch, there are a couple of important things to look at. It does specify specific types of facilities that the product would need to be produced at in order to be eligible for procurement. So that includes a composting facility or operation, a transfer or processing facility, or a solid waste landfill. So those are the three specified facilities from which that product would need to be produced. And then there also is a requirement for the jurisdiction to have an adopted enforceable ordinance or other mechanism adopted for that the mulch would need to meet specified land application standards as well. So those are some requirements specific to mulch that would need to be kept in mind. Scott, you want to weigh in on anything else?
No, I think you covered it, and that could be direct procurement or a direct service provider, depending on the details of the arrangement or relationship. But again, I think the hurdle for mulch and for this example would be meeting the source of the mulch and the details about whether it's direct or direct service provider.
So would you mentioned permits? So he's actually in a notification permit. So he actually uses the mulch as a feedstock and adds more material to it to meet the needs of his existing crops. So that's just a little clarification there. So notification tier, is that still considered one of the things you're looking at?
Good question. The details about exactly what permits are eligible are outlined in regs, and so without knowing exactly what facility and what permit they have, I probably can't speak to that, and actually that's not our area of expertise anyway. So I think that we could take, if you'd like to get in contact with us through the slcp.organics.calrecycle.ca.gov with the details of that, we could route it through to the right people to see what the situation is.
All right, thank you, Bob, for the question. Thank you, Michelle and Scott. So right now, it looks like we don't have any more questions coming in through the GoToWebinar platform or through the SLCP inbox. Just a reminder, we are here going over procurement questions until 3 o'clock. We have HF&H on the line with us. They help develop the model tools, one related to procurement. We also have our enforcement team here on the line. So if you do have questions related to procurement, please send them our way.
And Juliet, this is Ashley. Since we do have some time and we're just waiting for more questions coming in, how about we go back to the edible food questions? Kyle, if you're still on the line, I know you guys answered most of them, but if we could just read them for the broadcast and then just go over the response.
Okay, you got it, Ashley. So one question that I'm looking at here is from Edgar. And Edgar's question was regarding edible food, are there concerns about finger pointing as far as confusion between jurisdiction requirements and a perceived lack of proper understanding? Which jurisdiction is responsible for what? And if so, how do you plan on addressing this? And Edgar, I can also unmute you if you want to add any context to that. One moment. Okay.
No, I don't have any additional comments. Thank you. It was answered.
Okay, great. And then Kara, I think you answered that. Do you want to just respond on that question for those who are listening in on the webcast? Or I'll just respond. Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead and then I can add.
Okay, so Kara's response to that, just for everyone listening in, was our approach is to have conversations and make presentations to provide clarity. If you have a situation, you can contact the SLCP inbox or your local LAMD representative.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So yeah, I just want to add, this really, this regulation is a big lift for jurisdictions. And when I say that, I mean that it's not just the Public Works Department that needs to be engaged and involved in implementing the requirements of the regulation. So we've been having lots of conversations with cities and Board of Supervisors, helping to clarify the variety of responsibilities that it's going to take to implement the requirements in the regulations. And so we're happy to be a part of any conversations if you need us. We have some PowerPoint presentations that also help explain the various departments within a city or a county that need to be involved in planning and getting ready for the regulation, as well as then implementing the regulation. So, it's a real shift for many of our cities and counties. When you think of edible food, for example, edible food recovery is not something our jurisdictions have been. Many of them have not been, very engaged in that. So this is kind of a new area for them. So talking about, how that program can be implemented and which departments should be involved, that's going to vary. Planning for capacity and engaging with many different stakeholders is a new approach. And so it requires thinking and planning. And we're really interested at this time in meeting with each of our jurisdictions to help them with that planning and those conversations, if needed, with their elected officials, city managers, as well as CAOs. Thanks, Julia.
Okay, our next question is from Mary Ann. And after I ask Mary Ann's question, we're going to move on to Ariella's procurement question. So Mary Ann's question is, farmers leave so much on the ground that are not perfect fruit. How can we have the authority to have them collected?
Kyle, are you still on the webinar? I don't know if he is. So Sarah, can you just read Kyle's response?
Yes. So the answer was, agree that this is a big issue that needs to be addressed, but this food is typically not disposed and falls outside of these regulatory requirements. CalRecycle has worked with CDFA and others on this, and the California Association of Food Banks works a lot in this area. And Kyle is happy to discuss more offline, Marianne.
So Marianne, I don't know if you're unmuted or not, or if that helps answer your question. But if it doesn't, please contact us through the SLCP web or email address. But is she unmuted, Sarah?
She said she doesn't have a mic.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I should read that. Hello. So Marianne, hopefully that answers. But if not, happy to talk offline more on that as well.
All right, thank you both. So Ariella Lewis asked a question regarding procurement, and she does not have a mic either. So her question is, can you please elaborate on the adjusted procurement target?
Sure thing, Ariella. Thank you for your question. So the regulations do specify a mechanism for jurisdictions to be able to lower and adjust their procurement target if they can show that their previous year's procurement of energy products does not hit that target as calculated. So that it would be the previous year's procurement of transportation fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating. The regulations outline conversion factors for our recovered organic waste products, and it converts those energy products into tons of organic waste in order to kind of wrap back to the procurement target that is measured in tons of organic waste. So a jurisdiction would look to their previous year's procurement of those energy products, have all those records of those products, and they would kind of back calculate using those conversion factors to see what that would amount to in tons of organic waste. And if their calculated procurement target does exceed what their sort of converted previous year's procurement amounts to, then they're able to lower it to that previous year's quantity. And a question that might help us, or a question we've gotten and that might help as well is, is it a previous year's procurement of already eligible products? And that's not the case. So it could be, electricity or gas that's already being procured from non-renewable sources and things like that, but it's just those total quantities, not dependent on the source, would be used to factor in whether you can qualify for that adjusted target.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, the mechanism is triggered from a jurisdiction as part of their annual report. And so the jurisdiction has to keep records of the amount procured of these products in the previous calendar years to support their use of a reduced procurement target in the annual report. So there's only a couple sections of regulations that talk about this, and it's I think relatively straightforward. Definitely take a look at subsection J in the first section of Article 12, as well as the record keeping and annual report requirements relative to the alternate target.
All right, thank you all. So again, no more procurement questions so far. So we're going to toss it over to Ashley, and then we might be able to take a break before our final section.
Thanks, Julia. Sorry, turning on my camera. Since we have some time, I just wanted to go over some tools that we already have published on our website and tools that are up and coming. So as you guys know, HF&H, in collaboration with some of their sub-consultants in CalRecycle, we developed the 4 model tools. Again, they're the franchise agreement, the enforcement ordinance, the procurement policy, and the edible food recovery agreement. We also have an R3 local jurisdiction service rate study. Please note that study was conducted pre-COVID, so numbers may have changed post-COVID or during COVID, but that would help folks in determining about raising rates and their programs. We also have case studies, which HF&H also helped produce, but we will continue to update those as we find out more. We have model signage and labels, which you'll hear about in the collections presentation that's coming up at 3 o'clock. And those are in all different languages for the different collection container systems. So that is a good resource, and those are optional to use. You don't have to use them, but you're more than welcome to use them, and they can be customized. We have an overview PowerPoint and video about 1383, and we're actually working on some more videos to help the understanding of 1383. They're little short videos. We have a climate strategy and waste sector goals. This is kind of an infographic to explain the history of all the climate strategy things that have been going on in California leading up to 1383. A big one, which I think a lot of people have liked and have read, is the guidance on CalRecycle's SB 1383 compliance process. So that's Alan and Trisha and their team, and it talks about, you know, what is our compliance process and how does that enforcement work. So that's kind of a good preview of what the regs are saying. Also, as you guys have probably seen, we revamped our 1383 website. So there are web pages by topic, so procurement, edible food, collections, and also by audience. So if you're a jurisdiction, a hauler, a facility, and then there's some coming up soon. So like the non-local entities and local education agencies, those web pages will be up shortly as well. Scott and Michelle and their team have produced a procurement calculator and have also done a webinar on it. We have the recording of it. Once we get it ADA compliant, we will post it on the web. And we also have local implementation examples. So what are jurisdictions or your peers doing right now? So it's not using any of our tools, it's tools that they've actually created. So big thank you to Oceanside and Palo Alto who have submitted those to us. Those are on our website. They link to their website. So please check those out, and we're going to continually update those. If you guys send us what you guys have, we'll just vet it and look through it, and then we'll probably link to your website as well. Then it's not published, but if needed, we do have JPA agreement guidance. You can reach out to your local representative or send an email to the SLCP inbox if you'd like that as well. And then things that are coming up, and the timelines are not exact, but they're in the ballpark, so I just wanted to share those with you. We have capacity planning tools. That's probably the next biggest thing that we're going to be releasing, hopefully in the next few weeks. So there's an organic waste calculator that's coming out. And then for edible food, as you heard, we have a calculator, a survey, as well as identifying the tier 1 and tier 2 generators. So those will be coming out very shortly. Please sign up for our listserv. Like all of our tools, we'll release them and then we'll have a webinar about a few weeks later. So be on the lookout for that. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we have the model implementation record keeping tool. So that's coming out hopefully in the summertime. We'll have the department issued waiver forms coming out in summer. And we'll also have route review best management practices. So I believe collections may hit on this at 3 o'clock. But we will have best management practices for route reviews coming out in the summertime. And then also in summer, if not early fall, we're going to have the Article 2 new technology review process and application, the thing that Scott just talked about earlier. And last but not least, we do have one more regional webinar. If you'd like to tune into it, it's next week, March 30th from 9 to 12. It's aimed towards Northern California, but as you guys know, you can attend any one that you want. And we're always updating our web pages, so be on the lookout for that. And our teams are always willing to present at any board or council meetings that you need us to talk to. We're happy to explain what 1383 is. We're happy to provide any clarification that you guys need on the regulations. So please reach out to us if you'd like that. And it doesn't just have to be board or council meetings. It could just be a task force meeting, or just maybe your 1383 team needs to meet, or maybe just your public works department. So please let us know how we could help you in that aspect. And let me just check the SLCP inbox. We do have a question, so Julia, I'll just read it really quickly. It looks like it's procurement, so Scott, Michelle, if you're still on, and it could be part reporting. So this is from Nicole from San Bernardino County. As a transit provider in San Bernardino County, do we have a reporting requirement for the renewable energy we use in some of our clean buses?
Jurisdiction, for speaking to procurement, jurisdictions themselves, the cities and counties, or cities, counties, or cities and counties, it's wordy, are the ones that with responsibility for record keeping and reporting. If the transit authority is part of a jurisdiction or serving multiple jurisdictions through a direct service provider relationship, records would have to be sent to the jurisdiction if the transit authority is procuring eligible energy products for their buses, etc. Is that right, Michelle?
Yeah, that sounds good, Scott. And specifically too on reporting, yeah, like Scott said, there may be some records that need to be routed to the jurisdiction, but it would be the jurisdiction that city or county that would undertake reporting. Great question. Hopefully that helps answer it.
I don't see her on the webinar, so she may be on the broadcast, but we could always follow up with her also, just in case she's not listening to this one and it's a coincidence that she sent it into SLCP at the same time. So I don't see anything else right now. So if it's okay with everyone could just stretch their legs and we'll start promptly back at 3 o'clock with the collections presentation.
Thanks, Ashley, and thank you so much, Michelle, Scott, and Kristen. And just a quick shout out to Michelle, who joined us here from her vacation. So we really appreciate you all. See you back at 3. All right, it is 3 o'clock now. This is Julia Dolph. I work in local assistance, and I'm going to be providing a high-level overview of the collection requirements today. After the presentation, as usual, we will have a Q&A session, so we will have about 45 minutes for questions. So with that, I will get started. Jurisdictions are required to provide an organic waste collection service to all residents and businesses. This is what we refer to as automatically providing service or universal service. The resident or business is automatically provided the collection service rather than having to subscribe to it, and the resident or business must participate in that service unless they have been granted a waiver by the jurisdiction. Jurisdictions can comply with the regulations by providing a 3+, 3, 2, or single unsegregated container collection service. They can also use a combination of services. A 3-container service requires the jurisdiction to provide each generator with a green, blue, and gray container. The green container is for the collection of organic waste only. The blue is for the collection of non-organic recyclables, but may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles. And the gray container is for all other non-organic waste. A jurisdiction may provide additional containers or split containers for further source separation. A jurisdiction may allow the use of plastic bags or compostable plastics in the green container if the facilities the jurisdiction uses to recover the organic waste provides written notice to the jurisdiction that it can process or remove the plastic bags or compostable plastics. In a 2-container collection service, a jurisdiction may either provide a green and a gray container or a gray and a blue container. Under a gray and green container service, the green container is limited to organic waste only, and the gray container allows for the commingling of all other collected waste. Under a blue and gray container service, the blue container is limited to traditional recyclables, but may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles, and the gray container is for all other collected waste. In both scenarios, the contents of the gray container must be sent to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. In an unsegregated single container collection service, a jurisdiction may provide a gray container that allows for the commingling of all waste. The contents of the gray container must be transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. CalRecycle will use RDRS data to identify these facilities, and this information will be provided to jurisdictions. If a high diversion organic waste processing facility has an organic content recovery rate less than the 50% required by 2022 or the 75% required by 2025 for 2 consecutive quarterly reporting periods or 3 quarterly reporting periods within 3 years, then the facility will no longer qualify as a high diversion organic waste processing facility. If a jurisdiction is in violation due to its high diversion facility being out of compliance, the jurisdiction will be subject to the enforcement process. In this scenario, the jurisdiction must commit to one of 3 options: bringing the facility back into compliance, using a different high diversion facility, or must implement a 3-container collection service. In a 3- and 2-container collection service, jurisdictions are required to monitor containers for contamination. Contamination monitoring must be done for residential and commercial routes. A jurisdiction can monitor contamination by conducting route reviews or waste evaluations. Jurisdictions that choose to conduct route reviews must review all hauler routes annually. Containers may be randomly selected along a hauler route, and cameras can be used to remotely monitor containers. Upon finding container contaminants, the jurisdiction must notify the generator of the violation. Note that the regulations do not require the jurisdiction to impose administrative civil penalties on generators who are in violation of the container contaminants requirements. However, the regulations do allow jurisdictions to impose contamination processing fees or penalties for contamination. Waste evaluations are a facility-based container contamination compliance method. This is the alternative for conducting route reviews. Evaluations must be done at least twice per year and must occur in 2 distinct seasons. The evaluations must include samples of each container type, so all container colors, and the samples must be taken from different areas in the jurisdiction that are representative of the jurisdiction's waste stream. The regulations specify the minimum number of samples from all the hauler routes that must be included in the evaluation from each container type. If the sampled weight of the container contaminants exceeds 25% of the measured sample for any container type, the jurisdiction must either notify generators on the sampled routes of the requirement to properly sort, or must perform a targeted route review of containers on the sampled routes to determine the sources of contamination and then notify those generators of their obligation to properly sort. Note that a jurisdiction that is implementing a performance-based source-separated collection service, so this is outlined in Article 17, must conduct waste evaluations at least twice per year for the blue and green containers and once per quarter for the gray container. The regulations standardize container colors. The color scheme for containers is either the lid of the container is the required color, or the body of the container is the required color, and the lid is the required color or gray or black. A jurisdiction is not required to replace functional containers that do not comply with the color requirements prior to the end of the useful life of those containers or prior to January 1, 2036, whichever comes first. If a container has minor repairs and remains functional, it does not need to be replaced prior to 2036. In 2022, a jurisdiction must place a label on each new container or new lid that is provided to generators. A jurisdiction must either place labels on the body or lid of the container with language, graphic images, or both that indicate the primary acceptable and prohibited materials for that container, or the jurisdiction may provide imprinted text or graphic images on the container body or lid that again indicate the primary acceptable and prohibited materials for that container. The labeling requirements apply to all containers, such as dumpsters, carts, debris bins, and roll-offs in the residential and commercial sectors. Organic waste generators must comply with local requirements by either subscribing to the organic waste collection service that's provided by the jurisdiction, or by self-hauling their organic waste in compliance with the regulations. Commercial businesses must provide containers for the collection of organic waste and non-organic recyclables in all areas where disposal containers are provided for customers except restrooms. Businesses must provide collection containers that conform either to the colors of the jurisdiction service or the containers must have the required labels. Businesses must prohibit employees from placing organic waste in the wrong container and must periodically inspect containers for contamination. Generators are allowed to manage organic waste on site or use community scale composting activities. Commercial businesses, including multifamily dwellings, must provide or arrange for organic waste collection services for employees, contractors, tenants, and customers. This includes supplying and allowing access to an adequate number, size, and location of containers with the required labels or colors. Businesses must annually provide information to employees, contractors, tenants, and customers about organic waste recovery requirements and properly sorting material, and must provide information to new tenants before or within 14 days upon occupation of the premises. Businesses must provide access to their properties during inspections by the jurisdiction. The regulations allow jurisdictions to grant waivers to generators from the collection requirements. However, jurisdictions do not have to allow any or all of these waivers. and it is jurisdictions, not haulers, that must administer these waivers. Waivers must be reviewed every 5 years by the jurisdiction. A jurisdiction may issue a de minimis waiver to a commercial business if the business is generating a de minimis amount of organic waste. De minimis amounts of waste are less than 20 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate 2 cubic yards or more of total solid waste per week. And de minimis amounts of organic waste also include less than 10 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate less than 2 cubic yards of total solid waste per week. A jurisdiction may issue a physical space waiver to a commercial business or property owner if the jurisdiction has evidence demonstrating that the premises lack adequate space for any of the organic waste container configurations. Finally, a jurisdiction may provide a collection frequency waiver, which allows a generator to subscribe to bi-weekly collection of its blue, gray, or both containers if the generator is using a service that requires the placement of all organic waste in the green container. A jurisdiction may issue the collection frequency waiver for the entire jurisdiction, specific areas of the jurisdiction, or an entire neighborhood. A jurisdiction may apply to CalRecycle for a waiver to waive some or all of the collection requirements. A jurisdiction may apply for a low population waiver if the jurisdiction disposed of less than 5,000 tons of solid waste in 2014, and the jurisdiction has a total population of less than 7,500 people. Census tracts located in an unincorporated county with a population density of less than 75 people per square mile also qualify for a low population waiver. Low population waivers must be reevaluated by the department every 5 years. CalRecycle must grant a rural exemption if a jurisdiction qualifies as a rural jurisdiction under AB 1826 and adopts a resolution finding that describes the purpose and need for the exemption. The duration of the rural exemption is December 31st, 2026. After that date, jurisdictions may apply for the low population waivers if they meet the criteria. CalRecycle may grant an elevation waiver to a jurisdiction if the entire jurisdiction is located at or above an elevation of 4,500 feet. Census tracts located in the unincorporated county that are located at or above 4,500 feet may also apply for an elevation waiver. The census tract may be partially located at that elevation. Elevation waivers exempt generators from the requirement to separate and recover food waste and food soiled paper. High elevation jurisdictions are not required to provide generators with containers, as generators may continue to use their own customer provided or hauler provided containers that fit into their locked bear boxes. CalRecycle will be providing forms, guidance, and training in the May or June timeframe so that jurisdictions can submit their waiver requests starting in September. The regulations also establish conditions under which disaster and emergency circumstance waivers to temporarily dispose of organic waste may be granted by the jurisdiction. A jurisdiction is not required to separate or recover organic waste removed from homeless encampments and illegal disposal sites. The regulations outline 3 requirements that must be met to allow a jurisdiction to dispose of quarantined organic waste, and these regulations do not require generators, jurisdictions, or other entities to manage or recover organic waste that federal law explicitly requires to be landfilled, such as solid waste from international flights. Counties and each city, regional agency, and special district that provides solid waste collection services within each county must plan for adequate capacity for recycling organic waste. Each county will lead this effort. The county is responsible for establishing a collaborative approach to planning, collecting organic waste recycling capacity planning information from each jurisdiction, submitting the organic waste recycling capacity report to CalRecycle, identifying any jurisdiction, including itself, that does not have enough organic waste recycling capacity, and informing any jurisdiction that does not have enough capacity, the timeline for submitting its implementation schedule to CalRecycle. Capacity planning efforts must include the following materials: food, green waste, landscape and pruning waste, wood, paper products, digestate, and biosolids. And that concludes my presentation on the collection requirements. So with that, we will go to our final Q&A session. So just a quick reminder of how this session will go. To ask a question, if you're watching via the broadcast, please email your question to the SLCP inbox. If you're watching via the GoToWebinar, please submit your questions as you have been doing through the questions pane. So with that, we will go over to our first question. And I'm gonna take a second to get to that question. So one moment, please. Okay, so our first question is coming from Isaiah, Isaiah, sorry about the delay. You can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, so I put it in the chat box, but would a city be able to contract the services out for education, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting to CalRecycle?
Yeah, Julie, I'll take that one. Thanks for your question, Isaiah. I did respond, but I'll go ahead and repeat my response for everyone else on the webinar. So the regulations do specify that a jurisdiction may designate a public or private entity to fulfill its responsibilities, except its authority to impose civil penalties, which would be required upon each jurisdiction. There are certain requirements that need to occur during that point. The designation needs to be made through one or more of the following two ways. One is through contracts with haulers or other private entities, and two, specifically the regulations state agreements such as an MOU with other jurisdictions, entities, regional agencies, and that's specifically designed in the PRC 40181, or other government entities, including environmental health departments. So I guess the short answer to your question would be yes, but a couple of things to note regarding designating, and I think in your instance there, the local chamber of commerce, to perform those activities such as education, monitoring, and record keeping and reporting. One thing to note that ultimately each jurisdiction is going to be responsible for maintaining those records and fulfilling their compliance with the requirements that, as you stated within your examples. And then two, the record keeping requirement. The regulations are specific in the sense that those need to be housed in a centralized location, and they need to be stored centrally and easily accessible by the department upon any request that the department requests to see a jurisdiction's implementation record. So just something to note, as you're building and you're developing your jurisdiction's implementation of the 1383 regulations. But if you have any, hopefully that answers your question. I know that each nuance and each jurisdiction is going to have specific nuances and case-by-case basis of how each jurisdiction is going to be implementing their program. But from what I understood from your question, I think I hopefully answered your question. Does that answer it, Isaiah?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Okay, our next couple questions are from Liz Hall. Liz, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your questions, please.
Hi, everyone. Liz Hall here. I work with waste management in Monterey County. And yeah, I had two questions. I just wanted some clarification on the rule and the population waivers. There's been some debate about, is it the tonnage and the population combined, or are those two separate things, if that makes sense? And then also the difference between a route review and a waste evaluation, because there's also, been confusion. Are those synonymous or are those two separate things? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Hi, Liz. So this is Julia. I can start, and then Kara, I'm sure, will chime in. So for the first question regarding the low population waivers, so both thresholds have to be met. So you have to meet the disposal. So I'll just repeat what I said earlier. So the jurisdiction has to have disposed of less than 5,000 tons of solid waste in 2014, and the jurisdiction has a total population of less than 7,500 people. So it is both. You must meet both to get that low population waiver. And then regarding your other question about route reviews versus waste evaluations.
Julia, can you stop there? Because I think there's a little bit in Liz's note. She also had the 75 people per square mile. So I think we need to clarify there's a threshold for incorporated areas and unincorporated areas. Can you address that?
Yes, sure. So for census tracts that are located in an unincorporated county, they have to have a population density of less than 75 people per square mile to qualify for that waiver. And I don't believe they have a threshold for tonnage.
There is not. Liz, did that help clarify? And also, Liz, in your note, you have rural exemption. So rural exemption is a completely different type than a low population waiver. And so rural exemptions apply to those jurisdictions that qualify or meet the rural definition that was provided in AB 1826. So you have a few things going on in your question, and we wanted to be sure that we clarified. For the rural exemption, the definition is completely different, relates to population of a rural county and then a jurisdiction that's located within that rural county.
Yeah, as soon as I sent that off, I realized I misspoke. So thank you for making sure to clarify that.
Sure. And then it's going to depend if you have a special district that's providing solid waste collection services. If that special district is located in the unincorporated area, then they would be utilizing the census tract data for the 75 people or less.
Okay,
Did
great.
we answer all that? Okay, now we'll move on to the other one. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Kara. So to answer the second part of your question about route reviews versus waste evaluations, those are two separate ways that a jurisdiction can comply with the container contamination requirements. So a jurisdiction that's implementing a standard service, so a 3-container or 2-container service, can choose one or the other. You do not have to do both. I just want to point out again, though, that if a jurisdiction is implementing a performance-based service, so that's outlined in Article 17, then the jurisdiction must do a waste evaluation. There is no option to do the route review. And do you have additional follow-up questions about the differences between those two?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm just taking some quick notes for one of our local TAC groups. Apologies, there's a very loud truck outside of my house right now, but yeah, if you don't mind just clarifying those so I can type it down for everybody, that'd be great.
Sure. So really quickly, so for route reviews, so essentially the key points for that is that it's every single hauler route, and a hauler route is determined by the jurisdiction or the hauler, its designee, has to be reviewed annually. You can randomly select containers along the route to sample, so you do not have to do a lid flip on every single container on every single route every year. It's a random sample, and it's up to the jurisdiction or the hauler as its designee to determine what a sufficient number of route reviews or samples to look at on each route would be in your situation.
And Julia, just to add to that, when we talk about routes, we're talking about all residential, all commercial, and any industrial routes. And when we talk about the containers that need to be sampled, it's going to depend on whether you have a 3-container collection service on that route or a 2-container collection service on that route. So if it's a 3-container collection service on that route, you do have to randomly sample all 3 types of containers. And that's what Julia was referencing when she said container types. So on a route, gray container, green container, and blue container, They must all be sampled. We recognize that, you know, sometimes material is going to be bagged. There's not an expectation that you dive into those containers or dump out those containers. It can be a visual inspection, and as Julia noted, it can also include photographic inspection. So for example, some haulers have cameras on their trucks, and that's how they monitor contamination as it dumps into the hopper. There's some technology where the camera is actually in the container and monitoring contamination that way. So there's a variety of approaches, or you can do the traditional lid flip, looking in the container. Do I see anything or not? Go ahead, Julia.
Thanks, Kara. So to quickly review at a high level the waste evaluation, so that is a facility-based contamination compliance method, and that has to be done at a permitted solid waste facility. So this is the alternative to the route reviews. These waste evaluations have to be done at least twice per year and in 2 distinct seasons. And if contaminants in any of the samples taken, so again, you're sampling all of the containers, not just one, so all of the colors. If contaminants exceed 25% in any of the measured samples, then generators have to be notified about how to properly sort. And then I'll let Kara jump in and add any other details.
Yeah, the waste evaluations was intended to be a facility-based type of measurement. This is based off of Recycla, so that's LA City's waste evaluation process. So if anyone needs information, we can provide their guidance document on how that's done. But it is prescriptive in that it does require, you know, a certain number of samples per route. And so, you know, it's a matter of, you know, having space at the facility where you're doing that separation. And then in particular, measuring the materials. Again, each container type does get sampled. And then as Julia noted, for performance-based collection service, there's an additional sampling for gray containers. So it's more frequent for gray containers. Liz, did that help out?
Yeah, definitely. And as far as informing the generators for the waste evaluations, you would have to inform everyone on the route. Is that correct, that you collected that from? And then for route review, you would just like leave a cart tag or something very specific at time of service, right?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Super helpful. Thank you so much.
You bet.
All right, so continuing on with the contamination monitoring questions, Agnes also has a question about this. So Agnes, you're unmuted and you can go ahead and ask your question. And please state your affiliation again. Thank you.
Hi, this is Agnes Martellet. I'm with the City of Carmel. I think you guys answered my question as part of answering Liz's question. I'm pretty sure. Of course, I can't find it anymore because it's on a long list. Yeah, my question was what percentage of containers on each route are required to be reviewed annually? And I think you guys said there's no minimum.
That is correct. There's no specific percentage or requirement. And it's really up to the jurisdiction and the hauler to determine what a sufficient amount would be, depending on what your hauler route looks like.
Okay, and by hauler route, I'm assuming you guys are assuming there's not different. You're not assuming that there are different routes for different waste types, right? I mean, you're figuring there's you know, X number of residential, because they're depending on how the hauler routes are set up, they could have different routes for, say, recyclables and garbage.
Right. Yeah. So for example, say you don't have the same, say you're talking about residential, and you don't have the same number of routes for the recycling stream or the blue container stream and the gray container stream and the green container stream. So what you would want to make sure is that every route for, say, the gray container stream that you're touching it. So it's kind of unusual to have that situation, but if you did have that situation, you would want to make sure that all routes are reviewed annually. It doesn't, the regs don't provide kind of any subsets. So again, it's all routes must be reviewed annually.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Great, thank you.
Yeah. And some industrial routes might consist of 1 or 2 generators on the route. So it can vary quite a lot.
Okay, our next.
Go ahead.
Our next question is from Edgar. Edgar, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Edgar with the City of Reading, but I can see my question has already been answered and posted. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Sure.
Can we just repeat the question for the broadcast people?
Yes, of course. So the question was, when you say all containers have to be sampled, is that for the same location, or meaning generator, or just all different types of containers on a particular route? And the answer is that on a route, and it does not have to be the same generator.
Yep, you've got it. Now, there may be some reasons why you want to hit the same generator, especially if you're having some type of contamination issue. But the regulations do not lay out specificity on that, so there's flexibility.
All right, thank you, Edgar, for the question. So Mary Ann does not have a mic, and her question is, what about roll-offs? Should this be evaluated also? And I will let Kara answer that question.
Yeah, again, if roll-offs are a part of a route, then you do need to conduct that route review. And certainly it's important to monitor contamination of roll-off containers as well. And that's what we would call more of an industrial route. So the regs do lay out its commercial, residential, industrial routes need to be reviewed. Hopefully, Marianne, let us know that answered the question.
Thanks, Kara. So we do have a question from the SLCP inbox. This is from David Goldstein. And his question is, can we please ask about when and if mandatory service is required in residential or commercial sectors? And so I'll start with that one, and then Kara can jump in. So yes, beginning January 1, 2022, jurisdictions are required to provide service to all organic waste generators, both residential and commercial, and providing a service is mandatory. That's a big change in the regulations. It differs from AB 1826 because jurisdictions must provide that service, provide being the operative word, and jurisdictions, so it is a mandatory service. It's what we refer to as universal service, where the resident and business, they're automatically subscribed unless the jurisdiction has issued a waiver to that commercial entity.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is we do have a number of jurisdictions that for their AB 1826 mandatory commercial recycling or their mandatory commercial recycling programs are rolling out mandatory service for commercial generators that meet the threshold. And those jurisdictions are doing that because they had still very high levels of non-compliance. And so by rolling this out, one, it's a stepping stone to what's also required for 1383. Also, it helps to address their demonstration of making all reasonable and feasible efforts to implement their mandatory commercial organics recycling program. So David, hopefully that answered your question.
And I'm not seeing any other questions in either the SLCP inbox or in the GoToWebinar questions pane. So just want to remind folks that we are here until 4 o'clock if you do have any questions related to collections.
So everybody, I think we'll wait probably like 5 to 10 more minutes. I don't want people to stay on this webinar if there are no other questions. So hopefully everyone understands all of the things we just presented on. If you have any other questions that we haven't addressed, please let us know. Not all of our team members are still here from Edible Food and Procurement, but we're always happy to pass on questions as well. So we can wait like another 5 to 10 more minutes. I don't want everyone to have to wait if we're just all sitting here. So thank you guys for participating. And we'll just give about 5 to 10 more minutes and then we can start wrapping up. Thanks.
Hey, Ashley, we do have a procurement question that came in. I don't know if any of the procurement folks are still here, but if they're not, Ronald, we can get back to you on your question.
I don't think they are. They had to leave at 3:30, but there is a collection question underneath.
Yes, perfect. So Ronald, we'll get back to you. And then Edgar, I see you have a question. So I will unmute you right now so you can ask your question. And you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I'm trying to look over the text, the regulatory text itself, and I'm a bit confused. Maybe I'm confusing myself, but looking at your presentation, could you delve a little more into detail, my clarification, the 2 versus 3 container collection service and how it relates to either doing route reviews versus waste evaluations as it relates to container contamination minimization?
Sure, I can try, and then Kara can jump in. So jurisdictions that are implementing a 3 container service or a 2 container service are required to monitor those containers for contamination. So that goes for both services. And then again, a jurisdiction or its hauler, the designee, can either do route reviews as to monitor contamination for those containers in either service, or conduct waste evaluations. The only jurisdictions that don't have that option are the performance-based jurisdictions, and that's outlined in Article 17. Do you have any other specific questions related to either service?
Right, so I guess I'm trying to understand what the difference in particular is between the two type of services, because I'm looking at the regulatory text in and of itself, and it almost seems like they're somewhat similar but not. So I guess I'm trying to identify what the difference is between those type of services.
So under a 3 container service, I'll take a crack at this. So you have the 3 separate bins, right? You have a green, a blue, and a gray container. The green is for, say, food waste and yard waste only. Blue is for traditional recyclables, may include paper and cardboard. And then the gray container is for trash. And so during the route reviews, for example, you're going to be monitoring each type of container on every route to see if, say, there is yard waste in the blue bin or the gray bin, or if there is recyclables in the green bin that shouldn't be there. So that's the type of contamination you're looking for, are generators properly sorting the material into the correct bins, and if not, they need to be notified about that. For a 2 container service, you either have a gray bin and a green bin, or a gray bin and a blue bin. So in the green situation, the green is limited to food waste and yard waste. The gray bin is going to have the more traditional recyclables, maybe paper, cardboard, and trash. And so again, in that situation, you're going to be looking at both of those bins to see, is there trash in the green bin that shouldn't be there? Or are there bottles and cans in the green bin that shouldn't be there? Or is there food waste in the gray bin that shouldn't be there? So that's what you're going to be looking for contamination in those containers. And then again, tagging those bins, notifying those generators if they're putting things in the wrong container. So does that help?
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. I think what's not making sense in and of itself is going back to whether you have to do waste evaluations or conduct route reviews. That depends on whether you do source separation. Is that what it is? Or
it is your choice. So it's up to the jurisdiction which you would prefer to do. So the waste evaluations, they have to be done at a permitted solid waste facility. So, you may want to do that, or you may rather do the route reviews. So it is your choice.
Got it. Thank you.
And then we'll pass it over to Sarah to help unmute Patty.
So Patty, you're self-muted. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Okay, Patty's question is, how is a RO route defined? Is this a recurring weekly stop or any tags on a driver?
So I will take a crack at that one. So a hauler route is dependent upon the designated itinerary or geographical configuration of a jurisdiction's waste collection system. So essentially, it is the jurisdiction or the hauler that's determining what the hauler route is, and that's how you're going to figure out, how to do your route reviews or your waste evaluations. And hopefully that helps answer your question, Patty. So let us know if you need any other clarification.
And then just to add, Julia just mentioned the waste evaluation. So there are more specifics on the route and the sampling size in the regulations if you choose the waste evaluation route. So just wanted to clarify that as well.
Thanks, Ashley. We definitely kept it very high level. So again, always refer back to the regulations for the nitty-gritty and the details. And it looks like we don't have any other questions. So again, we have some time. If you do have questions coming up, just feel free to drop them in that question pane.
Thanks, Julia. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes to see if anyone is quickly typing a question or quickly emailing the SLCP inbox. But again, as you guys let this settle in and absorb all of this, if you have any other questions as you're reading the regs, please never hesitate to contact us to provide any clarifications on the regulations. We're always happy to do that. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes and then we could wrap up.
So we do have a question from Renee. And Renee, I can unmute you so you can ask your question out loud for everybody. All right, you're unmuted. You can go ahead. Okay, I can state your question and comment. So you're really enjoying the program. We're so glad that you are. So your question is, will we be able to receive a certificate of proof of attendance and the PowerPoint? So in terms of a certificate of proof, we have not been doing that. I don't know how we would. In terms of receiving the PowerPoint, we are recording all of these regional webinars. And once we have made all of the material ADA compliant, we will be posting both the PowerPoint and the recording and a transcript of the recording online. We will notify folks once we get that done via the SLCP listserv. So be sure to sign up for that, and that's how we will notify you once all of the materials are made available.
I don't see anything else in either the questions or the SLCP inbox. So again, thank you all for your presence and listening to us in this almost 3 hour long webinar series. We hope that you guys have learned a lot. But again, if you have any clarifying questions or as you're implementing 1383 and are unsure of something that we said in the regs, please let us know. We're here to help you guys. So I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you again for Sarah and Julia for doing the live Q&A. And then if you want to hear the presentation, it's the same for next week, but there may be different questions. Please attend next week's webinar as well, as that is our last regional that we have planned for this year. So thank you guys so much and have a great day. We'll give you back about 13 minutes of your day. So have a great weekend, everybody, and see you guys next time.